After 3 years of military service, I returned home and found out my husband had impregnated my sister, but I made them regret it. I remember stepping off the bus, uniform pressed, medals pinned, a backpack heavy on my shoulder, and a heart full of hope. I imagined my family waiting with open arms, my husband smiling that crooked smile I had once adored, and my little sister running toward me like nothing could ever go wrong. But the moment I walked through the front gate, something felt off. The air was thick, suffocating, and the laughter that usually greeted me was sharp, forced, like a knife disguised as sugar. My stomach twisted before I even saw them. Daniel was standing by the door, holding Ifeoma's hand, and there it was, the unmistakable swell of her belly. My chest constricted as I blinked, thinking maybe my eyes were lying, maybe exhaustion had warped reality. But no, it was true. My husband and my sister were together, and they were expecting a child. I wanted to scream, to throw my bag across the yard, to shatter every vase and plate I could reach. But instead I froze, feeling all the heat drain from my body. Amara! Daniel's voice trembled. My name on his lips used to feel like home. Now it felt like betrayal. I swallowed the lump in my throat and forced words I didn't feel. I see. I wanted to ask if they understood how it felt to return from serving your country, only to find your home torn apart by those you trusted the most. But I stayed quiet, because that silence was the only weapon I had at that moment. I didn't want to cry in front of them. I didn't want them to see my pain. Not yet. The nights were the hardest. I slept on the couch in my old room, staring at the ceiling, replaying every memory with Daniel and Ifeoma, wondering where it had all gone wrong. I remembered the way Daniel used to hold my hand in the kitchen, the quiet jokes we shared while washing dishes, the way Ifeoma's eyes would light up when she ran to me after school. And now, all of it felt tainted, as though I had been living inside a story written by someone else. I found myself making plans, and in the quiet, whispering to the shadows, "They will regret this. I will make them regret this." The anger simmered beneath the surface, not violent or loud, just a constant pulse that reminded me I wasn't broken. Not completely. I started small. I walked through the local market every morning, observing, asking questions, feeling the rhythm of the community that had always been my home. I realized how much control I had allowed Daniel to wield over my family, over finances, over decisions that should have been ours together. That control had shifted, unknowingly, while I was away. And now it was time to take it back, not through yelling, not through confrontations, but with quiet, deliberate moves. I smiled at neighbors, laughed in the marketplace, and made sure to greet everyone with a warmth that hid the storm building inside me. Evenings were the hardest when Ifeoma would sit nearby, showing off the beginnings of her growing belly, while Daniel whispered excuses into her ear. I watched without a word, noting every lie, every weakness, every misstep. My mind cataloged everything. I began to see patterns, opportunities where I could turn their pride into vulnerability. It wasn't enough to be hurt. I needed a strategy. I needed them to learn that betrayal carries a price far heavier than fear, and I didn't have to raise my voice to teach them that. Conversations with Daniel became exercises in control. I nodded politely when he asked about forgiveness, when he tried to manipulate my emotion. "It's okay," I said once, when he murmured that he still loved me in his way. My voice was calm, even, and it hid the fire inside. He had expected me to collapse, to beg, to plead. Instead, I smiled softly and walked away. That walk was more powerful than any argument I could have made. I felt a thrill of clarity. My life, my future, and my dignity were still mine to protect, and I would not hand them over to anyone who had betrayed me. I also began to notice the smallest things, how Ifeoma whispered to neighbors, trying to control the narrative, how Daniel's arrogance had left him blind to his own faults, how both of them relied on other people to carry the weight they shouldered. Each observation was another piece of the puzzle, another step toward understanding how I could quietly reclaim what was mine. I imagined myself like a chess player, moving pieces carefully, predicting responses before they happened. And the deeper I plotted, the more I realized something important. I didn't need revenge for attention or drama. I needed it for respect, for the satisfaction of knowing justice could be delivered with my hands untied. Sleep came in uneven doses, punctuated by dreams of confrontation and triumph. I would wake with my heart pounding, remind myself of the military discipline drilled into me over years of service, and take deep, steady breaths. Every day I walked among them, smiled, nodded, and planned. My parents asked if I was okay, and I simply said, "I'm finding my path." That was true. The path was narrow, lined with betrayal, but it was mine to walk. And as I lay my head down each night, I whispered promises to myself, not curses, not threats, but commitments. I will rebuild, I will rise, and they will see. Even as the house buzzed with tension, I felt a strange calm. I knew the coming months would test me. I knew whispers would travel, judgment would arrive, and temptation to lash out would tempt me. But I had learned patience, the kind of patience that waits not for apologies but for openings. I had learned to hold fire in my heart without letting it consume me. And as I traced the lines of my old bedroom ceiling, I realized that the moment of pain was also a moment of opportunity. They had underestimated me, and that was their first mistake. I remember standing at the doorway one afternoon, watching Daniel argue with Ifeoma about money, his voice sharp, hers defensive, and I could feel the ripple of insecurity beneath it all. I stepped back silently, letting the argument play out like a rehearsal for what was coming. Their eyes met mine briefly, and I saw a flicker of uncertainty, a crack in the facade. I smiled just a fraction. That flicker was proof. The game had begun, and I held all the pieces I needed. They had taken from me, but I would take back more than what was lost. I would take respect, stability, and admiration. They would learn the weight of underestimating a woman who had faced war and returned with her mind intact and sharp. By the time the sun set that evening, painting the sky in streaks of orange and purple, I sat on my porch, a notebook open in my lap. I jotted down ideas, plans, and observations, each line a careful step toward reclaiming my life. There was no yelling, no screaming, only the quiet hum of a heart learning to trust its own strength again. And as I closed the notebook, I whispered to myself, "This is not the end, it is only the beginning." That whisper felt like power. That whisper felt like freedom. That whisper felt like hope. I knew that shouting, or confrontation, wouldn't fix anything. So I started quietly, using the savings I had accumulated during my military service to buy a small plot of land just outside the city. It wasn't much, but it was mine, and that ownership gave me a sense of stability I hadn't felt in months. I would wake early, walking the dusty paths of my property, imagining what it could become. Warehouses, storage yards, small offices, places that could generate income and influence. Every morning, as the sun crested the horizon, painting the land in gold, I felt a flicker of excitement. It was the first spark of my new life, built carefully, brick by brick, without anyone knowing. Setting up a logistics business wasn't simple, but patience and discipline had been my companions in the military, and now they guided me again. I made calls, met contractors, and slowly built a network. I listened more than I spoke, noting weaknesses in others' operations, learning where competitors failed, and making mental notes on how I could outperform them. The locals began to notice the new energy I brought into town. People who had once laughed at my family's internal dramas now nodded respectfully when I passed. I smiled at them warmly, keeping my mind focused on bigger goals. I didn't have to scream my ambition. It showed in my actions, steady and deliberate. Meanwhile, Daniel and Ifeoma were sinking deeper into financial strain. Their debts piled up, unpaid bills stacked on counters, and I noticed how often they came to me for help under the guise of family necessity. I listened politely as Daniel explained why he needed temporary funding for a failing project, and I nodded, keeping no hint of my own strategy on my face. I offered small, calculated loans, just enough to keep them afloat, but not enough to save them. Every interaction was a test of patience and foresight. I observed how desperation changed them, how their arrogance turned into panic. It was uncomfortable to watch, yet it reinforced the reality that I was gaining ground while they floundered. The community began to respect me for my work and reliability. I didn't have to announce myself. People talked. They admired the way I managed contracts, ensured deliveries were on time, and treated workers with fairness. I smiled often, remembering how small gestures could cement loyalty, a warm greeting, a compliment, even listening to their stories. My influence grew without anyone noticing the strategy behind it. At gatherings, I would laugh with neighbors, share stories, and slowly, quietly, I became someone people turned to for advice. Daniel and Ifeoma, on the other hand, became cautionary examples in whispers and sideways glances. Their credibility slipped while mine strengthened silently, steadily. I kept careful tabs on Daniel's business ventures, ensuring I knew when projects failed or partners withdrew. When he came to me requesting guidance, I gave vague advice, just enough to appear helpful, but always steering him toward decisions I knew would falter. I noticed the tension it created between him and Ifeoma, her frustration growing, his pride wounded, their collaboration deteriorating. Each misstep was a silent victory, though I didn't celebrate. Quiet observation was my method, and patience was my ally. They didn't suspect I was orchestrating their decline, while simultaneously building my empire. I also invested in my own personal growth. I enrolled in leadership workshops, read extensively about strategy and management, and networked with influential figures in logistics and commerce. Every skill I acquired became another tool in my quiet arsenal. I could feel my confidence solidifying, my voice gaining weight in conversations, my presence commanding respect. Walking into any room, I felt an undercurrent of attention and admiration. It wasn't about vanity, it was about power earned through effort, strategy, and composure. Daniel and Ifeoma couldn't replicate that, because their foundation was built on deceit and short-term thinking. Some days I caught myself smiling when I remembered small things they had done to betray me, not out of cruelty, but because each memory reinforced the path I had chosen. My sister's whispered lies in the marketplace, Daniel's careless promises to others, the way they underestimated my resolve. It all became fuel. I learned not to let anger control me, but to convert it into foresight. I would anticipate their moves, predict their desperation, and remain 3 steps ahead. That calm, deliberate approach was more satisfying than any shouting match could ever be. I would sit on my porch after long days, sipping tea, listening to the hum of activity on my property. Children ran past, neighbors waved, birds sang in the morning light. I laughed at memories of family chaos, like when Aunt Mabel tried baking cookies at midnight and set off the smoke alarm. Those moments reminded me that life wasn't only about revenge, it was about reclaiming peace. Yet, even in laughter, I planned, plotting each step with precision, never letting complacency sneak in. I began collaborating with other small businesses, extending contracts, improving infrastructure, and establishing myself as a reliable figure in the regional market. My reputation was no longer just a rumor, it was tangible, reinforced by results. Daniel and Ifeoma tried to maintain their standing, but every mismanaged deal, every mistake they made in haste, pushed them further into irrelevance. I could see it in the way suppliers hesitated to work with them, in the way whispers reached the market about their failure. The contrast between our positions was stark, and it gave me a quiet satisfaction that no words could convey. Instead, I cultivated patience, resilience, and a presence that commanded attention without demanding it. The more they stumbled, the more I flowed. I started mentoring young women in the community, sharing advice on business and personal growth, ensuring that my influence wasn't limited to profit, but extended to respect and admiration. Daniel and Ifeoma were forgotten in these circles, their voices drowned out by the credibility I had built silently, steadily. By the end of the year, I had expanded my land holdings, grown my business into a recognizable force, and cemented my reputation as someone dependable and strong. I no longer feared confrontation, because my power lay in preparation and observation. Daniel and Ifeoma were shadows of the confidence they had once flaunted, asking for help, making excuses, and losing credibility with every misstep. And though no one outside my inner circle knew it, I had begun plotting the final steps, the subtle maneuvers that would expose their deceit fully, dismantle their pride, and establish me as the leader no one could ignore. It was slow, methodical, and entirely satisfying. Every day I reminded myself why I had started this journey, not for revenge alone, but for the restoration of dignity, control, and love of self. I had returned from military service stronger, disciplined, and ready to face the world, and I was proving that strength quietly, systematic. And in that silence, Daniel and Ifeoma were unraveling, unaware that their every move was being recorded, analyzed, and countered by someone they had once thought powerless. My life was becoming a story of triumph, built on patience, strategy, and unwavering focus. By the time I decided to make my move, I had all the pieces I needed. Daniel's company was teetering, Ifeoma's social credibility was fragile, and the community's trust had quietly shifted toward me. I began offering contracts to Daniel's logistics firm through my own business, but with careful planning. Every contract I issued was designed to fail under the weight of circumstances only I fully understood. Deadlines were tight, resources misaligned, and partnerships deliberately flawed. Daniel and Ifeoma had no idea that the woman they had betrayed was orchestrating these failures with meticulous precision. I watched as panic replaced arrogance, frustration replaced pride, and slowly, their control over others began to crumble. A shipment Daniel had promised to deliver on time arrived late, damaged, and incomplete. Clients murmured, suppliers hesitated, and a whisper of doubt rippled through the market. I listened politely when Daniel called to explain, nodding while hiding the satisfaction bubbling inside me. He was desperate, and Ifeoma's irritation grew into audible anger. I observed them without interruption, cataloging their reactions, learning how they tried to cover their mistakes. Their attempts to save face only revealed their weaknesses more clearly. The community, meanwhile, began to look at me differently: reliable, competent, strategic. I also began planting seeds about Ifeoma's behavior. Quietly, I shared details of their schemes with neighbors, in casual, innocent conversations about how she had manipulated friends, exaggerated hardships, or spread misinformation. Nothing harsh, nothing confrontational. The facts spoke for themselves. People began to question her honesty. Whispers grew into skepticism. I smiled when I heard subtle murmurs in the market, small expressions of doubt, realizing that by simply presenting the truth in calm, strategic ways, I could dismantle her credibility without ever raising my voice. Daniel tried to rally support from friends and colleagues, but my network had already begun to notice inconsistencies in his leadership. I made sure to maintain my composure in every public encounter, offering advice, mentorship, or collaboration with a warmth that disarmed suspicion. People admired the way I handled challenges, respected the way I prioritized integrity and results. Every handshake, every polite nod, every thoughtful conversation added to a growing reservoir of influence that Daniel and Ifeoma could no longer touch. By the time they realized the extent of my strategy, it was too late. They were trapped in a web they hadn't even known existed. Ifeoma's attempts to explain her side of the story fell flat. Eyes that once followed her in admiration now questioned her motives and honesty. I walked through the room, smiling, shaking hands, exchanging greetings. People looked at me with respect, and some even approached me for guidance on their own ventures. The contrast between us was stark: Daniel and Ifeoma floundering under scrutiny, while I stood tall, composed, admired. I felt a wave of quiet triumph, knowing that this was the result of patience, strategy, and deliberate action, not drama or loud confrontation. I acquired more land, invested in community projects, and strengthened relationships with local leaders. Every action I took was deliberate, with long-term impact in mind. I was no longer the woman who had returned from military service, betrayed, and heartbroken. I had become someone unshakable, a leader in her own right, respected for intelligence, resilience, and foresight. Daniel and Ifeoma could only watch as their credibility eroded further, their debts accumulated, and their social standing dissolved. I had turned betrayal into an opportunity to elevate myself, and it was a lesson they would never forget. One afternoon, I received a call from Daniel, voice trembling, asking if I could help him salvage a deal that was already doomed. I listened carefully, nodding softly, and offered advice that sounded reasonable, but would ensure the outcome I intended. Ifeoma hovered nervously in the background, whispering questions and complaints, unaware that every word she spoke only reinforced her fragility in the eyes of others. When the deal inevitably failed, Daniel's frustration erupted into anger. "Amara, why are you doing this to us?" he demanded over the phone. I smiled quietly, placing the receiver down, knowing full well that justice had been delivered not by force, but by intelligence, patience, and deliberate action. I had become a pillar of the community, someone people turned to for advice, partnerships, and guidance. Daniel and Ifeoma, once so full of arrogance and confidence, were now cautious, their influence diminished. I continued to interact politely with them, offering aid in measured doses, to highlight my own strength and reinforce their dependency. Every request they made, every mistake they repeated, only cemented the reality that I was in control. Their pride had been dismantled silently, steadily, without a single confrontation or raised voice. I spoke about integrity, planning, and resilience, highlighting the importance of honesty and foresight in business and personal life. I watched as neighbors nodded, took notes, and asked questions. Daniel and Ifeoma sat silently, embarrassed, unable to speak up without drawing attention to their own failures. It was poetic, the lesson delivered publicly, yet subtly, without any need for drama or confrontation. The respect in the room was mine, earned, unshakable, and irreversible. I continued to grow, investing in new ventures, mentoring young women, and fostering networks that thrived on integrity. I had taken what was meant to break me, betrayal, deceit, humiliation, and turned it into a foundation for success. Daniel and Ifeoma were reduced to whispers of their former selves, watching as the woman they had wronged became a respected leader. I never gloated, never raised my voice, but every time they looked at me, they understood they had lost, and I had triumphed. Not through anger or confrontation, but through patience, intelligence, and quiet perseverance. Standing on the balcony of my largest property, the wind brushing my face, I reflected on the journey. I had returned from military service, with a heart open, only to find betrayal waiting at home. Yet, through strategy, observation, and disciplined action, I had transformed that pain into power. My community respected me, my influence was undeniable, and my dignity intact. Daniel and Ifeoma had learned the cost of underestimating me. I hadn't just survived their betrayal, I had outsmarted it, and in doing so, I had built a life that no one could take away. I knew the story would linger in the community, whispered in markets and hallways, the tale of a woman who faced the ultimate betrayal and emerged stronger, wiser, and respected. I had proven that revenge doesn't require noise or spectacle. It can be quiet, strategic, and devastatingly effective. And as I watched the sunset paint the sky in streaks of gold and crimson, I whispered to myself, not in anger, but in quiet satisfaction, this is what true strength looks like. Moral lesson: life will sometimes betray us through the actions of those we love, but strength comes from patience, focus, and resilience. True power isn't shouting or hurting, it's rebuilding quietly, earning respect, and leading with integrity. Every setback carries a lesson, if we observe carefully and act deliberately. Betrayal can be transformed into opportunity, and hurt can become a foundation for growth. Trust yourself, plan wisely, and hold your dignity above all. By walking with patience and intelligence,
you can overcome even the deepest wounds, emerge stronger, and inspire others with the calm confidence of someone who turned adversity into triumph.